World Muslim Communities Council online. Welcome back to our lecture again, and I hope you all are fine and safe and healthy in your places. Today, it's our great honor to have Professor Adnan Al-Zulfikar from Rutgers Law School, USA, to join us for a very profound and insightful lecture titled Digital Islamic Law and Fatwas in the Era of COVID. As you may see from this title, it's very relevant and very frontier research has been done by Professor Adnan. So Professor Adnan is a Juris Doctor and PhD, and also a legal historian working on Islamic law, criminal law, and law in many areas. And he has been involved in many important projects and affiliations, in particular the law in global south with specific interest in legal obligation, jihad, and revolution, policing, criminal codes. He previously helped draft or implement criminal codes in the Maldives and Somalia. He regularly provides expert media commentary for various outlets, including ours today. And he's also very proficient in many languages and has spent over a decade in Middle East, South Asia, and Sub-Saharan Africa. Actually, I know Professor Adnan from a very famous program, is Islamic Law program in Harvard University, in which Professor Adnan is one of the important contributors. And in terms of his research and expertise, he often focuses on critically examining the framework underlying legal discourses in both domestic and global contexts. These including criminal law and procedure, Islamic jurisprudence, and rule of law in the global south. And he has published many work. I think one of his work is, let me see, there's many, I couldn't let I want just to focus on the most important one for you. So I think his current one is working on this Islamic law, mapping COVID and Fatwas project in collaboration with Harvard Law School's Sharia source. So without further ado, we welcome Professor Adnan to start his lecture. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum to everyone who's joining us today. I appreciate very much the invitation from the World Muslim Communities Council to share some of my thoughts and research as it relates to this topic, broadly on digital Islamic law, but very specifically on this idea of fatwas in the age of COVID. So what I want to do today is I'm going to sort of go through some of my ideas with regard to digital Islamic law broadly, and then I want to look at the sort of case of COVID fatwas specifically. And partly what I'm sharing with you here, these are some preliminary thoughts that I've been developing over the last year or so, ideas that I hope to continue to work on. They are connected, as I will talk later on, to a mapping COVID fatwas project that I am engaged in collaboration with Harvard Law School and their program in Islamic law, which thus far has collected over 100 fatwas specifically related to COVID, and have made them available to the public through our website. And we continue to collect these fatwas from all around the world in many different languages. So my goal today is to give you some of a sense of the landscape of digital Islamic law as I sort of see it, or at least for my as it's important for my purposes. So digital Islamic law, broadly defined, is going to encompass a lot. But there are three significant areas, and particularly areas of growth, that I'm most fascinated by and find quite interesting. The first area is as it relates to texts, right? So what has happened over the last decade plus, and particularly in recent years, is that a lot of the texts that we have, the different books that are in manuscript form that haven't even been put into a published edition, many of them are being made available. They're being digitized and being made available. And these are some of the collections that exist. In addition to that, there are also many editions, volumes in different languages that have been published. And these are part of the Islamic legal tradition, legal heritage, if you will, that have also been digitized and made available. Some of them just as PDFs, others in searchable form. And there are a variety of different projects that are seeking to do this in new and different ways. So now you have many libraries around the Muslim world and throughout the world as well that have large collections of Islamic legal literature that they are putting online, that they are making available to the public. This opens many possibilities. The idea of having access to these type of texts means that you can sit in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, where I am, and look at documents without having to go to Timbuktu in Mali or without having to go elsewhere in the world. So in that respect, it gives you many possibilities of sort of expanding your research without some of the other constraints. It also, in terms of the searchable databases that are being set up, it gives an opportunity to explore in a wide way patterns that might exist within legal traditions. And there are certain projects at Harvard in particular around legal canons that are doing this in very fascinating ways, where you can look at a word or a sentence or a phrase that has legal meaning and see how it's developing over time, how it exists in different parts of the legal tradition, in different geographies, and then draw certain conclusions from that. So this is a real exciting place with regard to digital Islamic law. Then you, of course, have what have existed now for a little while, but the personal websites of jurists, of faqihs, of fuqaha, and ulama, and scholars more broadly, who are on the web and sharing their writings, sharing sort of news items with regard to their happenings, but also involved in question and answers and issuing of fatwas. What this has done is it's increased the accessibility of many of these jurists to the global public. Jurists also then can access a much broader audience. Just like the audience, more people can access them, they can also access many more people. And the global, in some respects, has become local. It's easier to know the opinion of a jurist across the world. Sometimes it's easier to know that opinion of the jurist across the world. It's easier to do that than to even know about the opinions of jurists within your own city. So in that sense, the global has really become local. And we've seen this play out quite a bit over the last 10 years or so. Then the final area that I find of particular interest, which connects then to these personal websites of jurists as well, is what I refer to as sort of the fatwa websites or the question and answer websites. Now, some of these are associated with specific jurists. Others are, like Islam WebNet and others, are broader. They're basically a place where anyone in the global public can ask a question and then get it answered by some scholar associated with that website. Likewise, many of the agencies within the Muslim world who are responsible for issuing fatwas, so the Dar al-Ifta agencies in various countries, they themselves also have websites. And in my research, I also know with regard to the Agency for Waqf in the UAE that they have this e-fatwa dynamic also going. So a variety of different opportunities there. This basically allows a couple things. The first is these websites allow you potentially to get an opinion that's custom tailored to you. If you think about these as sort of suits that you would purchase for a business meeting, some of these websites will get it custom to you, your specific question with regard to your particular concern. You can submit it and the jurist may answer you back. But in addition to that, one of the fascinating ways in which the public is now able to access fatwas is the fact that you have a wide range, a collection, a repository of fatwas that are now available online. These are basically fatwas that other people have asked, questions that other people have asked that now are available to you. So that itself is a great resource now that allows you to sort of access different opinions. All right. And finally, the area which I said there are three areas of significant growth, but there's another area that I have to include, and that is with regard to social media. Social media is an area that's giving even greater access to the jurists and for the jurists to the public. The fact that you essentially now have jurists, faqihs, and ulama who have their own sort of press offices, if you will, where they can issue opinions right away, or they can issue their thoughts with regard to a variety of current affairs that may be going on. So that itself ends up being particularly useful. All right. So with that in mind, though, we have to also think about the fact that there are consequences to this. There are consequences to the fact that when you begin to have this type of access, you allow for something known as forum shopping, if you will. This is a legal term, but essentially allow people to go and pick and choose jurists whose opinions they may like. Right? Before, this opportunity didn't exist in that same way. You were restricted to the jurists in your particular context. Right? Now you have a greater choice of juristic opinions, but these have positives and negatives. The positive is that you're not bound by local expertise. You can find better opinions, or if you will, you can find more specialized individuals to offer these opinions. The negative is that a practice of seeking favorable opinions, favorable outcomes that you want, is now sort of superseding or making the consistency of the method by which those outcomes are sought less of a concern. What do I mean by that? I mean that people are less concerned with regard to following the same principles of interpretation, the same method of interpretation to arrive at conclusions, and hence have some consistency with regard to that. They're far more concerned now with whatever the final opinion is that they can get. This creates certain, I think, theoretical challenges and larger challenges as to what does that mean with regard to religious practice in the modern period. The final issue, though, so aside from these positives and negatives, is that in this grand marketplace of ideas where you can go and seek out an opinion on any issue at any point that it's coming up for you, we have the potential decline in the development of what I call Sharia instincts. In my view, historically, and in the in sort of recent times as well, one of the attributes of Muslim who are engaged with regard to their legal tradition is that they develop over the course of time, regardless of how much religious knowledge they have, certain levels of Sharia instincts as opposed with regard to what the sources of the tradition might say on a particular issue. Now, there are countless new situations that a Muslim believer comes across in their everyday life, and they require the application of those Sharia instincts to those situations. However, if the practice becomes that you can just easily access the opinion of a scholar via all these mechanisms, then potentially you create a dependency on a scholarly answer, which stunts the development of your own understanding with regard to the Sharia, with regard to the sources of legal tradition, let alone sort of the fiqh interpretation that traditionally was there. And that stunts the development of your Sharia instincts, which inevitably at some point you will continue to need to exercise. So that's a potential consequence that exists. Okay. So with all this in mind, we come to the situation of COVID fatwas. And COVID fatwas, I think, are particularly interesting for a number of reasons. Let me return to my PowerPoint, if you will. Okay. So COVID fatwas are particularly interesting for a number of reasons. They highlight the challenges and possibilities of the existing digital landscape. This sort of challenge of how you deal with local expertise versus global expertise, global opinion versus local opinion as it relates to scholars. It highlights some of the challenges there and the possibilities. Some of these issues that I outlined with regard to fatwa shopping come into contrast here, and we'll talk a bit about how. But they also hit on deeper questions about what is authority and what is authoritative in Islamic law. They touch on ideas around tradition and modernity and that sort of balance between the two as to preservation of tradition and accommodation of modernity. So with that in mind, about a year ago, after the COVID-19 virus found its way into the United States, I teamed up with, I'm an editor at Sharia Source at Harvard Law School. I teamed up with the program in Islamic Law, along with my own institution, Rutgers Law School, to launch this Mapping COVID-19 Fatwas project. And as I noted to you, the project essentially came about for a number of reasons. The first, and I would say most important one, was that in this moment where COVID-19 was going to place certain restrictions on the globe, the question of what that meant for the religious obligations of Muslims came to the forefront. Now, these obligations, many legal obligations that are required of the Muslim believer, immediately were of concern because Ramadan was right around the corner. And so there was a question as to what was going to be done during this period of time. Likewise, you had this the sort of regular congregational prayers that occur daily, but also in particular on Fridays in a larger size, that became of central concern. And the question became, to what extent can these obligations be suspended during this time? So because my own interest is around legal obligation, this became quite fascinating to me as I began to see these fatwas coming out. Now, they were coming out, so their content was fascinating. But before I get to the content, it was also fascinating how they were being discovered. And part of that was a real sort of discussion around or an exploration of traditional formats of issuing fatwas and then the modern formats that existed. And the way this came about, or this recognition of these sort of this fascinating collection of different formats within the fatwa universe, was because as myself and other researchers went to seek out these fatwas, we realized that they were not going to be found in the traditional places that we had anticipated. We were not going to find them necessarily in some written document that we could then look up. That did certainly exist for certain jurists in particular, but oftentimes there were many modern formats. Many jurists, many prominent jurists, were issuing their fatwas verbally in some type of TV show or some video address that they were making to their constituents. Likewise, you found many fatwas being issued on Facebook or on Twitter. And you had to sort of track these down to see if there might be a written document behind it, but there wasn't necessarily one. That many jurists were comfortable just issuing their fatwa on Twitter alone. So this was a fascinating new space that raised many interesting questions. Now, there are, of course, a number of, and when we did it just for visualization, we looked at a variety of different countries. This is sort of a general count of that. We looked at different types of fatwas, video and written, and some of these need to be updated, but in general, it was very international. We spanned quite a few places when we were looking. This also gives you a little bit of a breakdown of where these fatwas are being found. And there are several questions that came up when we were looking for them as to what we were going to count as a fatwa, who we were going to count as a legitimate issuer of a fatwa, which I'll raise in a little bit. Now, certain common themes came up in this, which I think are interesting. And again, just sort of to lay out the landscape of what was occurring with COVID fatwas. The first is this: there was the initial fatwas tended to be around understanding and coping with the virus, or what I would call theological concerns. They were concerned primarily with the question as to, is this God's punishment for something, either for our own transgressions or for the transgressions of another country that is experiencing it? So initially there were questions around China in particular, because that's where it started, but then these questions broadened as the virus got closer and closer to different Muslim countries. The coping mechanism also arose, which was both not just understanding this, is this God's punishment or could it be just a trial, but what is this? But then there's the question of how do we cope with it, and the idea of faith in God. Now, the faith in God idea becomes particularly important because when we get to the point number 2, the suspension of obligations, the question around which obligations could be suspended or how could they be curtailed from their normal practice began to connect with this idea of faith in God. Was the curtailing of religious practice an indication of a diminished faith in God, of less faith in God? And this sort of became, these were the types of questions that began to be posed to many scholars that they tried to respond to in their fatwas. And finally, most recently, is this question around the permissibility of vaccines. To what extent are vaccines permissible? And this really relates to the types of ingredients that may be involved in either the processing of the vaccine or the end product itself that potentially fall in the category of haram or impermissible or forbidden. Okay. You began to see a variety of different sort of variation as well, a lot of local variation as to how these fatwas were being addressed. And so you see, for instance, Iran being one of the first countries that began to really deal with the epidemic, that their fatwas, take these issues on and then are dealing with many of the things much later or much earlier than other countries. For instance, Iran is already having discussions around last rites, to what extent for janaza and burial of bodies of patients who have died of COVID, what are the prohibitions there? What is permissible there? What's not? Iran is addressing these issues very early on because of the severity of the virus in Iran initially. So the timeline and severity of the virus begins to impact the content and the types of fatwas that are being issued. Likewise, the strength of government authority. If there is sort of a some sense, and let me move to the next slide. If the government authority is particularly strong, then their ability to sort of issue edicts with regard to the virus seemed to be a bit better. And that was reflected in the fatwas that came out. So not only were their ability to issue edicts that people would follow a bit better, but they also were able to dictate the sort of nature of the fatwas that were being issued. There was less diversity in the fatwas, where there was a stronger government authority, whether that be even to the point of an authoritarian authority, or even less so, more centralized type of control. Then the extent to which the population was used to prior restrictions also factored in to what the content of these fatwas were. If that society had had the experience of religious obligations being suspended at different points in the past, or their freedom of movement being suspended, then it was much easier, or you would find that the fatwas did not spend much time trying to come up with accommodations that might allow for relaxed restrictions as opposed to just the full-on public health restriction. And the nature, finally, of religious discourse, religious authority, was also particularly important here. Okay, so with that in mind, there are two ideas that I think are particularly important when we look at these fatwas during COVID, but then in general as well. The first is this idea of the authoritative, right? The idea of the authoritative. And here I'm going to stop my presentation so I can talk to you for a little bit. So the question becomes, what counts as a fatwa? What counts as authoritative? To what extent does a tweet count as a fatwa? Right? The reason that this obviously comes in because it's such a departure from the traditional formality that's associated with the issuing of fatwas. So that's one question. What other types of speech might be counted as fatwas as well? Does a statement that issues an opinion but is not formally titled a fatwa still should it still be considered as a fatwa? What about an article that a scholar writes with regard to their detailed opinion about the coronavirus and restrictions within it? Or a khutbah by an imam? These are traditionally not fatwas as we have understood them, but is the effect that they have the same as a fatwa would? In other words, the idea of prescription, religious prescription, if you are issuing a prescription with regard to behavior, to what extent should that be considered a fatwa? And so is the less formal also less authentic? Is the substantive opinion all that matters? Or is the ritual behind fatwa issuing also important? Does a fatwa have to look a certain way? And then finally, almost most importantly, who decides? Who decides what counts as a fatwa or not? And what I would offer here, which is a bit new, is that ultimately the public has an outsized role in deciding what counts. And that's simply because prescription, religious prescription, is only as valuable as the one who decides to follow it. So that leads us to another point, which is the idea of authority. So in addition to the question of what counts as a fatwa, the other question is who counts as a scholar? Who counts as a faqih or an alim? Can an alim even be a faqih? In our traditional understanding, historically, these tended to eventually become very distinct categories. But identifying a faqih or a jurist in modern times, I would offer, is much more complicated. How are we to do it? Is it their pedigree, their affiliation, their formal title? When certain institutions within the Muslim world no longer exist that were producing these types of sort of pedigrees and affiliations, etc., no longer exist in the same robust manner. They may still be there, but they don't have the same status within society. There are many more players in the marketplace. Many people are offering opinions as it relates to religious prescription, something that people were maybe more careful or less or more reluctant to do in the past. Who then counts? And what about this idea about local authority versus global authority? Different opinions are issued everywhere. If you find an opinion that is more sound and from maybe a higher ranked scholar globally, is that the one you attach to or the one that's local? And then there's a question of the state versus jurists. And this becomes particularly fascinating in the COVID context. The jurisdiction of what is the territory of the state, in which the state issues legal edicts, versus the jurists, where the jurists issue legal edicts, it has been roughly defined, and sort of an understanding existed in most societies. But COVID disrupts this terrain for many Muslim countries. It disrupts this sort of balance between the authority of the state and the authority of the jurists. Public health concerns end up standing at times in opposition to religious obligation. And the key question becomes, when can you suspend religious obligation? The issue to examine there is the idea of necessity. When is it necessary to suspend these obligations? But what many states had to deal with, many countries had to deal with, was deciding who determines when this necessity exists. Who has the expertise to make this determination? Because you need actually expertise from at least two main realms. You need expertise as to the religious understanding of what situations of necessity, maybe analogous situations of necessity, allow for the suspension of religious obligation. And then you need what might be scientific expertise, public health expertise, as to the reality of the current situation and what is necessitated in order to save lives. Now, in states, in countries where governance is by decree, this doesn't come up as the same type of issue where there is governance by some notion of consensus, or at least where there is a broader constituency that has to be pleased. Stronger states as well may not have the same challenge here as weaker states. So the question of authority looms over this entire COVID situation and highlights long-standing issues that are there, but that now come into stark contrast because of the life or death type of situation we're dealing with. All right. So to give an example of that, let me point to one particular interesting case that came up. So around early March, or at some point in March or the early 2020, and then sort of late March is when the result came out. But the president of Pakistan requests the Supreme Council and the Sheikh of Al-Azhar to provide guidance with regard to the obligation for congregational and Jummah prayers in mosques, in masajid, during the coronavirus. Now, by way of context, the Pakistan at that moment was being defined as potentially having super spreader type of concerns with regard to the coronavirus. That because there were still regular congregational prayer and the virus seemed to not be in control, that there was a real threat here of a super spreader type of phenomenon. And so there was a desire to suspend Jummah prayers, right? And essentially the ruling, the fatwa that comes out from Azhar in Egypt, again, Pakistan here, Azhar is in Egypt, permits the suspension of Friday prayers. The fascinating thing here, again, highlighting these questions of both state authority versus jurists, but also the global and the local, is that the Pakistani context is not one that is devoid of religious authority or religious expertise. There is a significant amount of expertise there, many prominent jurists that exist within that space. Pakistan has a very robust scholarly tradition. But the Pakistani president was not getting traction with the jurists in his own country, with the ulama, the scholars in his own country, and he needed to control this virus. So he reaches out for global authority in the hopes that it will allow him to supersede the local authority of his religious scholars. In some respects, it's quite unprecedented. It's quite unprecedented. To my knowledge, I did not find similar occasions in recent history, at least in the Pakistani context. Now, in the end, it was ultimately, you could say, somewhat unsuccessful, and maybe somewhat successful. There was no suspension of congregational prayers, but there was a sort of compromise that was reached whereby prayers, congregational prayers, were quote unquote restrained. There were guidelines set up and certain restrictions with regard to these prayers. And the many prominent ulamas like Mufti Taqi Usmani came out saying, we should follow the government's requests on this in terms of how these prayers should be limited, right? So there was no suspension, despite the authority that Azhar had given for this to happen. There was no suspension of congregational prayers, but the ulama, broadly speaking, said in Pakistan that they would sort of create certain restrictions. Now, the extent to which those were actually followed beyond sort of certain places, it's unclear. But in the end, to some degree, the local religious authority won out, you could say. Okay, so let me conclude with a few thoughts that kind of are my key takeaways or key ideas from this particular discussion. The first is the transformation of the fatwa. The fatwa as we have understood it and as it exists today are quite different. The substance is generally the same in that a question is being answered. But the nature of the fatwa, what that content looks like, how you access that content, where it appears, is markedly different. It comes in both written, audio, and video forms. It ends up occurring in sort of traditional written format with some letterhead, etc. But it also occurs in tweets or Facebook posts without any other sort of written document that it's commenting on, right, or building off of. So the transformation of the fatwa has been a fascinating development as well. And arguably has been going on for quite some time now, but in the age of social media has exploded in some ways. Then the second issue is what I call expertise on the information highway. One of the things that has disrupted some of this relationship between the state and scholars or different communities of experts in a society and religious experts is that the information highway have allowed both sides to access knowledge that maybe they would not have the same access to in the past. That religious experts can now do some basic or gain a basic understanding of scientific phenomenon or the COVID-19 virus, for instance, in the same way that many of us did when the virus came out. We were consuming information to try to figure out how to alter our behavior or not. Likewise, as I've described previously, religious knowledge is far more accessible now to everybody. And that then has given other folks who may not previously have felt like they had that level of expertise, the ability to access either themselves religious knowledge or, as in the case of the Pakistani president, to seek that religious knowledge that provides the outcome that they want elsewhere, to seek that knowledge elsewhere. The third point is that despite that situation in Pakistan, the local is still supreme. That reliance on global opinions or reliance on global scholars has certainly increased, but the local that is crafted to that particular context, its culture, its history, its traditions, continues to be supreme. The authorities that matter most from the religious perspective are usually the local ones. And finally, the court of public opinion. And this is my essential point, that the public plays more of a role within the determination of what is and is not legitimate or authoritative as it relates to Islamic law than we're usually willing to admit. That the people who adopt the prescription given by the religious authorities have a role with regard to what is and is not legitimate, or what is or is not authoritative. If an opinion falls too far outside of what they have cultivated as their own Sharia instincts, then they will tend to reject that, and that fatwa, that opinion, will not have much traction. So in many respects, they become key arbiters within the discourse on Islamic law, and that is something that we have seen in this era of COVID and in this world of digital Islamic law more and more. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, dear Professor Adnan, for this wonderful and informative lecture on digital fatwa in age of COVID. Unfortunately, we are still living in this age, like time of COVID, and our religious activities and obligations are still limited in many parts of the world. So I think your lecture today and your insight from this lecture are really helpful, both for our religious leaders, for our imams and muftis, and even for common, ordinary Muslims to rethink and to examine how we should live a life, balancing our religious obligations and with public health concerns, and as well as complying with all these measures issued by the government and for our safety and health. Thank you again for this wonderful talk. So we do have a few questions from our audience, if you don't mind. First question asked is like, as you may know, that fatwa is a personalized legal opinion that takes in consideration of the circumstances of the one who is seeking fatwa. So this is the, I think, standard understanding of what it means fatwa. But how to respect this fact with in the age of the what we call, or you just mentioned today, like Sheikh Google or online fatwa nowadays. So can this still hold in this time?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. And I think part of the challenge is that usually, so that is absolutely the case, right? The fatwa was catered to a person's particular individual situation. But as with prior tradition as well, and I would argue not simply with the fatwa tradition, but even as we look within the hadith tradition, even where the Prophet, peace be upon him, issued opinions, right? Or gave it, not even opinion, but issued decrees with regard to some individual's particular situation, people began to adopt that for themselves. In the same way, in subsequent sort of centuries, when you had fatwa collections being published from major scholars, right? Ibn Taymiyyah, others, people began to take those fatwas, some of them which were general, but some that were arising out of particular circumstances of a person, and apply them within their life. And I think the tendency that people have, and have always had, is to see whether the advice that is given to some particular person with certain circumstances, even ones that they don't know, might somehow be applicable to their life. In the current age, where those fatwas are far more accessible, that you can basically access all of those particular answers to these questions, it becomes much harder and harder to control them as being specific to one individual. In addition to that, the tendency tends to be for many scholars to now issue broader fatwas, even when they're asked questions by a specific individual. That in anticipation of the fact that people are going to use these for a variety of situations, they might give a broader fatwa as a result. So I think that's something to kind of bear in mind. But yeah, it's certainly a new reality.
Thank you, Professor. We have a question from Michael and Michael Kramer. What impact does the COVID situation has for further disruption of a global Muslim ummah when Muslims are not sure which fiqh or alim should be followed, or which mufti or alim should be followed? Also, as you showed some statistics from your research, are these statistics, how many fatwa contradict with the national law?
So those are great questions. So I did not examine specifically the levels of contradiction with national law, right? I tended to, where those became apparent, like in the Pakistani case, I might highlight those for my own research here. But within our collection, we were just sort of collecting them together. Oftentimes, what I did notice, generally speaking, was that in most cases, the state and the scholars were trying to be on the same page. Either the scholars would follow the state's lead, or the state sometimes, rarely, would follow the scholar's lead, or there would be some kind of compromise. But in many cases, obviously, for coronavirus, there weren't necessarily laws that were pre-existing addressing coronavirus, but the states were coming out with public health decrees, and the extent to which scholars might oppose that, there was a challenge, or there was a effort by the state to find some area of compromise. Were there certain sort of scholars who completely opposed whatever restrictions the state would be putting forward? Yes, but they are a minority within those. And many times they were imams or preachers in a masjid who were maybe saying certain things in their khutbahs. And we sort of made a decision earlier on that those types of sort of pronouncements in a Friday sermon by just sort of a local imam, we weren't going to include within the corpus of kind of fatwas themselves. And we kind of had to make a decision on that, partly just in terms of capacity. With regard to, could you repeat the first part of the question?
Yeah, it's like, what kind of impact will this
have on
affect Muslim globally, like with their life and with their fatwas, with their fiqh?
Yeah, I mean, I think that I've tried to outline some of the potential consequences here as they relate to the challenges of kind of forum shopping of Muslims looking around the globe to kind of get the opinion that they want, even if it's outside of kind of the methodology of the sort of legal school that they follow, or that they've traditionally kind of been part of their practice. So I think there's that challenge that exists. But I think that there are broader challenges as well as it relates to religious authority in these moments of existential crisis. So my sort of research oftentimes is interested in obligation, but particularly obligation in these moments of existential crisis. The other area that I'd looked at in the past is around the Arab Spring revolutions. And there as well, you saw very fascinating opinions coming out from different ulama on different, on sort of different ends of the spectrum, as it related to some existential concerns that the public had around ideas of dignity and freedom, etc. Here, you have similar ones, but now they're around life and death and sort of obligation, faith in God, etc. And so, to that extent, I think that certainly, where you see, for instance, if it'll be interesting to see the impact on this moving forward, where you had many very prominent scholars in Pakistan die of COVID-19, and arguably may have been connected to their not abiding by restrictions in the same way. Is that going to impact sort of how the public views religious authority? It's hard to tell at this stage.
All right, thank you. Just to another question somehow related to this one is, as you may know, the hosting organization of this lecture and is the World Muslim Community Council is an international organization dedicated to promote and empower and take care of Muslim communities, especially Muslims in as a minority in their own country. We call them communities or minority groups in terms of their Islamic discourses, education, and institution, governance, etc. So I think this COVID situation and the situation you just concluded, that how this COVID and digitalization, information technology transformed the way fatwa is issued and propagated, really is a new challenge or new uncertainty for Muslim in those countries, as a community or as a minority. And I think you're also in Pennsylvania now, right? Yeah.
Yes.
So what would be this situation you identified would have impact on Muslim minorities, and in terms of their following fatwas or opinions? On the other side of the coin is like now in Muslim countries, as the main scope of your research, we have a lot of non-Muslim populations. Like here we are in the UAE, we have more than 200 nationalities, and many of them are not Muslims, and or Muslim actually from many from other countries, from like the non-Muslim countries or from another Muslim countries. There they follow the different mazhab, different fatwa. But now they all have to face this situation. So how this is I think it seems complicated. Is there any way to address this?
Yeah, no. So I mean, I think that these highlight some of the challenges. So let me take them two kind of separately. With regard to Muslims who are minorities within their own society, one, it'll depend on that particular society, right? So in the United States, it's a particularly unique religious minority here, Muslims are, because it's incredibly diverse, right? You have Muslims from all over the world in very large numbers, and then you have indigenous Muslim populations of African Americans and so that are quite significant. And so there are different local religious authorities functioning, and oftentimes with very different madhahib, etc. But in addition to that, there is no centralized religious authority per se in the United States. There are many sort of groups that pronounce themselves as such, right? Assembly of American Muslim Jurists, Islamite, there's Fatwa councils, etc. But none truly have wide-ranging authority within the country. And so as a result, there is many of these issues become even more highlighted within kind of the American Muslim minority population, even more so, I would argue, than certain Muslim minorities in Europe, where they're a little bit more homogenous ethnically as compared to the US. So yes, that's a problem. Now, what's the solution to that? It's very difficult, right? Even outside of coronavirus, it's very difficult because in addition to kind of the absence of this type of authority here, that there, people are quite fierce about their independence and their freedom and ability to access different opinions as it dictates their behavior here in the US in particular. Now, so I'm not sure what type of solution there is there. With regard to the UAE and other countries where you have other Muslim populations, there's likely to be, I've seen a tendency for those other Muslim populations to just follow the rule of that land, right? So they tend to, even if they're connected to a particular school of thought from back home, they tend to be quite influenced by the religious authority and environment that they're in. And you see this, and some research sort of indicates the impact, for instance, on Saudi religious thought on sort of migrant workers there when they go back, and kind of the sort of impact that has. As for non-Muslim in these societies, to some degree, the religious question is also raised for them, right? So to what extent, if you're not suspending masajids, can you suspend churches? And what do you do in a situation, for instance, if you decide that, we'll allow masajids to be open because there's only one person who is going to be leading the prayer and verbalizing, and so less kind of droplets of the virus potentially out there, versus a church where there may be a gospel that's singing. Can you make that type of distinction in sort of a fair way? And I think that's challenging. I think that's going to be difficult. And so I think for any country that has large religious minority or minorities of other religions, they have to factor in, even when they are making decrees with regard to their own faith, the potential legal impact of that on other faiths, and seek some level of fairness in how they do that. How precisely that turns out, I think, will depend on the particular context.
Very good. Yeah, I think these are very satisfactory answers we are seeking from you. And so our audience and our colleagues would like me to extend their thanks and appreciation for your great contribution to the lecture and to this council and to the global Muslim subscribers and who watched the show today. And it will be continuing on YouTube and Facebook if somebody else want to watch again or to want to forward. And in particular, personally, I also I learned a lot from you today, Professor Adnan. And I'm sure in the future, we have more opportunities and occasions to ask you for your expertise and for your opinion about these very demanding and crucial questions facing Muslim communities today.
Thank you very much for your time, and I appreciate the invitation and the opportunity to share some of my ideas. And I wish you much success with the important work that you all are engaged in.
Thank you very much. Our lecture is over today, and thanks for your attending, and see you next time.
Thank you.